Hi, I'm Kolesinskas. I'm a conservation scientist and soil scientist, and I'd like to share with you my over 40 years of experience of assessing land and properties for agriculture. So today we're going to do what I'm calling a land assessment. It's a consistent way to go out and evaluate a piece of property for its potential for agriculture. So it doesn't matter whether you're leasing a piece of property or buying a piece of property, you should have a consistent way that you're going to go about evaluating it and then comparing it to what your business, financial, and personal goals are. So I'm expecting you to be part researcher, detective, and trained observer. I want you to have the relevant facts, and if you have the relevant facts, then you're going to be able to minimize your risk when it comes to purchasing or leasing a piece of property. So let's get started. So here we are in Vernon, Connecticut, and we're about to start our land assessment. So again, I expect people that they should be doing some pre-work before they actually go out to a site. You want to collect a lot of information like maps and photos. We're very fortunate in Connecticut to have a wide range of natural resource and community information about the demographics of the community, the planning and zoning, the soils, the bedrock and superficial geology, the water quality, the topography. So those are all great tools and resources that you can get a lot of information about a property before you actually go out there. So, and then definitely visit the site and the community, drive around, walk around, talk to people, talk to the landowner or the owner. If somebody has been farming it and you can talk to them, get some information from them, talk to neighbors. So I think that's going to provide valuable information. Think about what expertise you have. Maybe you're a carpenter and it can assess the buildings, or maybe you have a forestry background or a strong soils background. And though if you are lacking some of that expertise, you may want to bring somebody else out to a piece of property that you're assessing, or at a second visit if it looks promising. Think about what expertise might be helpful not only for your business but also relates to specific that piece of property. So, and then I like to use a checklist. I think it's really important, particularly if you're evaluating multiple pieces of property, to make sure that you've consistently documented what the conditions are, what the features are, what the attributes are. And so there are a number of checklists that are out there. I like this one from University of Vermont Extension. It's called a rental assessment checklist. It can certainly be used for purchasing as well, but it gives you a way to consistently evaluate a piece of property. I think that's really important. So, or just a pad of paper to write down some information. And then what this is that any of us that are involved in the land business, real estate business, it's what we call, you're going to be doing your due diligence. You're going to find out as much information you have about what the attributes are, what the conditions are, what there might be some risk associated with, whether it might be potential contamination, or that, for instance, if it doesn't have a good consistent water supply and you're counting on that, you're taking some risk by not accounting for that. So let's get into more detail about our land assessment. So just to finish up our conversation about infrastructure, I'm sure as you saw from the beginning of this that there is a barn, and wouldn't it be nice to have a barn? So a barn can be an asset or a barn can be a liability. You know, for one thing, an older historic barn, even though it appears that it's an asset, oftentimes it's really difficult to retrofit a historic barn into a configuration and a use the way that we use agricultural buildings today. So it may be possible that it might be great for the CSA pickup, but it's too small to put in the size of a tractor that we might need to put in a barn today. So always think about that. There's a lot of properties in Connecticut that have these big old stanchion dairy barns, which a friend of mine calls a canoe barn. Basically, the only thing that they're used for is for storing canoes, because you can't get modern equipment in there. The stalls and stanchions are too small for today's dairy animals, so just be careful about that. So this particular barn that you see in back of me, you can get a better picture of why this barn is actually coming down. So the owners have made the commitment they're going to take down this farm structure because water got into it, there's a lot of rot internally, and it's just not stable and would cost way too much to try to fix up and restore. So I know that they're a little sad about that, but I think that's a good decision. So that's why for some building infrastructure, it may be great to bring in, a carpenter or a structural engineer, somebody that's really capable of evaluating the structural integrity of the barn. And that may be something you can negotiate with the seller or with the owner if it's a lease of what to do with those buildings and making sure who's responsible. The other thing that you'll see is that there's quite a bit of debris. So you have to expect on any farm property that there's probably going to be some debris. It may be a farm dump, it may be a piece of equipment, it may be some tires. So whose responsibility is that to clean that up? You may have to figure that into the cost. It may be part of what you can negotiate. So I think it's important to take a look around, ask questions, and know what might be there. So the next area that we're going to talk about is property rights and potential limitations. So as we think about it, every property has a bundle of rights to it. So it's the right to farm or to do recreation or to develop structures. So you can't assume that all properties have the same bundle of rights that are going to be available to you when you purchase it or lease it. So you need to be very clear. So if possible, get a copy of the deed, read it over. If you need somebody, an attorney or someone that's knowledgeable about conservation easements, if it's had the development rights that have been extinguished on it, exactly what that means, so you understand what the limitations are that you're working with on a piece of property. So this property has 2 conservation easements on it. So one of the easements is very farm friendly, which basically means you can farm pretty much any of the open field area that you see. There are some restrictions on where fencing can go. And then you can see down in this major field here, there is no farm road. So obviously when it was in hay production, that was really not critical. But if you're going to do some more intense production, lay out some fields for fruit or vegetable production, or even, put in a fencing system for rotational grazing, something like that, you're obviously going to need to have some farm roads or some animal paths and trails, something like that. The other thing that you can see is that right along the edge, it looks like it's mown a little bit more than some of the other areas, and that's because the other easement that it does have public access just around the edge of the field. There's actually a mowed walking trail around the edge of the field. So that could be a limitation for some kinds of agriculture, particularly animal agriculture. I have certainly been on farm properties in Connecticut where it's a well laid out trail with good signage, and it's posted where people would come onto the property about what the limitations are. You could even, the easement does allow restrictions during the growing season or portions of the growing season. So I think this property can certainly work for somebody, but you wouldn't know that unless you actually read the deed that goes along with the property to know what the limitations are. And then right in front of me, there's a portion of the property that they call the farmstead envelope, and that's where any additional buildings that are going to be built on the property, that's where they're going to be placed. Which from my perspective, to have this nice open field of excellent soils without farm buildings on it is probably a good thing. And but it does have a specific farmstead envelope, and right next to that farmstead envelope, there's a couple of small office buildings. And so that you need to keep that in mind as far as activities and neighbors, and again, understanding local planning and zoning of what kind of setbacks there might need to be for any buildings or fencing, those kinds of structures. So other limitations of the land, this particular property Off to the left there, you see there's a couple of stakes in the ground. So I went over, investigated that, and there's actually a sewer manhole. So there is a sewer easement that goes across the property, and so it's just certainly being something to be made aware of. I think it doesn't adversely impact its agricultural use, and though if you were to do a buried main line, you'd certainly want to know for an irrigation system or for animal watering, something like that. You'd want to know where that sewer line is and at what depth, and make sure you do a call before you dig. So unless you looked at the parcel map for the property, which I do have a copy of, you might not necessarily know that it has that level of restriction. So here's a copy of the parcel map with all the surveyed boundaries on it, so you can really see what's included, what's not included, and the fact that there is a sewer line easement on there. So otherwise you might not necessarily know that. So of course we can't not talk about the natural resources and how that might influence the suitability of a piece of property for your agricultural business. And of course, me as a background as a soil scientist, it's all about the soil. So it doesn't matter even if it's indoor production and you're building a building, you still need to know something about the soils. And I think if anything, from a climate change perspective, it's even more important than ever to know about your soil resources. Depth of water table, depth of bedrock, is it on a steep slope? Is it going to have a potential for erosion? All of those kinds of factors. So we want to look at the soil suitability. Again, look at the vegetation. I talked about the fact that this has been in hay production for a long time, and though it looks like a pretty good stand, even though we're coming out of a drought, it looks like it's responding well. So I would imagine it's had some lime and fertilizer applied to it. I think it's important to know when that is, and whether or not it was, organic, inorganic. If someone were trying to go for organic certification, it would be important to know that. Get a copy of a soil test result if that's available, to know kind of what your conditions are. Because again, if it's a short-term lease and the soils are not in good shape from a soil health and nutrient perspective, that you're going to put a lot of time and effort and money into a piece of property that doesn't have healthy soils with the right kind of conditions that you're looking for. So we'll talk about kind of the basic properties of the soil, and then we'll also talk about a way to get more input on the nutrient status. So that would be a soil test like you would send into the Yukon Soil Test Lab, or Cornell, or Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. And so typically if I'm going to go out on a piece of property, not knowing whether or not there's a soil test that's been available, I'll have a couple of plastic bags and a marker and of course a map in my pocket, so I can do a quick soil sample and take it and send it in for analysis. So something else to keep in mind. And again, we talked a little bit about the water source. So again, it's water quality, water quantity. This actually has a stream in the back of the property, and the neighbor property has a pond that could be used. Obviously, if it's a large amount of water you're going to be using, you'd need to consider whether or not you're going to need to have a permit from Connecticut Department of Energy Environmental Protection. But if it's a small amount, that's not necessarily under 50,000 gallons per day. But you need to know the quality of the water. If you're expecting you're going to do overhead irrigation, need water that's going to be wash water for produce, you want to have potable water. So for instance, I would ask whether or not the well at the house, whether or not that's had a water quality test. And if you are going to be pumping out of a pond or stream, to have the water quality tested in those as well. Know if there's going to be sufficient quality. The topography, is it a flat parcel? You can see off to the right there's a little bit of slope. So part of that slope obviously is too steep, not suitable for row crop production. Best kept in permanent vegetation like grass or shrubs or trees. There's a little area that's brushy. Past land use, somebody had scooped out a little bit of sand and gravel there. So again, thinking about your detective and investigative responsibilities here is to ask the question yourself, well, why is that brushy area there? That's because somebody scooped some gravel out. So anything that you see that looks slightly out of place, try to investigate. You know, that pipe sticking out of the ground, is there a buried oil tank there? Or maybe it's an old well that you might have access to. Most Connecticut farms have some well of some sort if there was farm buildings on it. It may be an old dug well, or it could be something more substantial. So you can see in back of me that it's largely wooded, and as I said, there's about 24 acres, almost 24 acres here that are part of this property, and though there's only about 13 acres that are in a field and available to use. So you might ask, well, what about, could any of that additional acreage be cleared? So we talked about in back of the barn. I think that's worth investigating on whether or not that could be used more intensively. And though the portion over here, I think if you were to investigate that, you would find that it's dominated by wetlands. So you might say, well, Kip, I'm not a soil scientist. How do I know whether there might be wetlands there? And also, how do I know the suitability of the soils for vegetables, for pasture, for a vineyard, hops, hemp, whatever? So I think the best place to start is with the soil survey. So U.S. Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources Conservation Service, in cooperation with the land-grant universities and the federal agencies, has mapped soils across the United States. So for like 99% of all private lands in Connecticut and across the country, there is some basic soils information that's available, telling you depth of bedrock, depth of water table, steepness of slope, all those things. And you can even do, as I talked about doing pre-work, through Web Soil Survey, which is a free online tool, by using the address of the property or coordinates from a topographic map, you can get access to soils information. So here I've printed out a custom soil report for this piece of property. You can see here's the outline here, and then going through the routines for the online tool, I was able to create a soil map. So these are areas that are dominated by certain soils. And not only does it tell you what the soil name is, which is the lowest level of the classification system that soil scientists use for soils, it also can give you a brief description of what the soils would look like. And I would recommend that this is a planning tool. It's good for giving you a general idea, but nothing is going to replace an on-site investigation and digging a hole in the ground and looking at the soils with somebody that's knowledgeable about it. So as we put this all together and analyzing the results from our reading the land exercise here, so first of all, does the property meet your needs and goals? And again, you should be thinking about that through the whole time, and you're documenting what you've seen and what your experiences are, what you think might be needed if you're going to use a property. Have you talked to people in the community? Have you talked with somebody who's farmed it or used it, or the landowner? Do you need another site visit? Are there professionals that you need to help you decide whether or not a building is worth fixing up or needs to come down? Does the price reflect the value of the property for your operation that you have planned? And if it doesn't meet your needs and you want to visit other properties to compare it to, make sure you're writing down what are the attributes of each of those properties so you can consistently compare them, and what's the level of importance to you. In some cases, if you're, maybe you have a significant other that has a job in Hartford, well, that you can jump right on the highway here. It's 14 miles to Hartford, or you have some restaurants in Hartford. That's as part of your customer base. That would be very important for this particular property to understand that. Is there follow-up testing, whether it's water tests, soil tests, to check out whether or not that pipe has a underground oil tank to it? and get a better idea of what costs that might be associated with, if you did want to put a fencing system around this whole field, what's that going to cost you? And then I want you to feel more confident about your ability to do a land assessment by understanding what the important features are and how that relates to your farm operation and your personal, financial, and business goals. So thank you very much for joining me today, and hope you are successful in finding a farm or additional farmland. Thank you.